And it is live. Welcome back. And no, we will not be this will not be Sigmund Bloom and Jene Bramel and Matt Waldman and the ghost of Cecil Lammey. I know he probably feels a little lighter after spending 8 hours out in the sun at Broncos training camp, but he's back, and we're back. Training camp's back. Football, I mean, it's kind of back. It's practically back because we have so many things to talk about tonight. And tonight, joining us before we get into the Cecil Lammey from Broncos Training Camp report, we have, of course, looking dapper and in a nice, bright, shiny room and a nice, bright, shiny face and aura, Mr. Matt Waldman. Good evening.
Good evening. How you guys doing?
Oh, I'm great. I've got the spaceship here in front of me. This is like, I don't know if it's a good ship lollipop or the USS Audible.
It does have this kind of Stanley Kubrickian kind of thing going on that's like heading right towards your face.
Right. No, we are not. See, this is where someone says saucy Q. And by the way, guys, I did a podcast this week, and I shared with them that we do have a safe word on the Audible, and they knew about it. But I think this is maybe something we could, an innovation, yet another innovation from podcasting from the Audible, and always innovative and always leading the way in most everything and keeping us calm, too. And we've got a lot to ask you. See, Gene, for everything we've been picking your brain, Dr. Jene Bramel, for the last couple of months, now it's like every day we're going to have things. By the time we get to Thursday night, we can just do a whole Dr. Jene Bramel show, but we wouldn't do that to you. How are you doing tonight?
No, please, let's not do that to anybody. I don't know. I'm going to have a hard time. You're running the show again, and you've got the white mic. I'm kind of confused. I'm not sure. I'm just going to have to listen and not look to get confused much. But
people often do confuse Cecil and I. I mean, if you go into the shark pool, you'll see people talk about, remember that time that, Bloom was all run. Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's good and bad. We get mixed up. It's all mostly good. And the guy, and I'm going to see you tomorrow night. I can use your microphone tomorrow night. Back, and I saw a picture of you hanging out with John Fox today. Just, another day for Cecil Lammey.
Yeah, just another morning with John Fox and company out at Broncos training camp. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Bloom. I owe you at least a couple of vodka and tonics or whatever we choose to inebriate ourselves with tomorrow night in Colorado.
Rocky Mountain High, Colorado. Okay, so we're going to pepper Cecil with some questions as training camp is opening, and we always get the drop on all things Broncos. And Cecil, I guess I just want you to revisit this because I was moved by your Emmanuel Sanders stumping during the off season, and I've been taking him. It's been moving up, mid 7th, early 7th. Now it's mid 6th, early 6th. I'm willing to go higher. As of this moment, do you still feel like that's the smart play among the wide receivers in Denver?
It's definitely the smart play among the wide receivers in Denver. I mean, we know that Demaryius Thomas is the favorite target for Peyton Manning. He's absent in training camp. Death of his grandmother, the woman who raised him, so he's back in Georgia taking care of family business. But it's all Emmanuel all the time, and I know you'll ask him about Cody Latimer a little bit later, but Sanders in the way that he can do multiple things. Adam Gase, this isn't the same as let's do what we did last year and have the same results and just play better defense. They're going to do different things offensively, and those different things offensively include going deep. Again, deep routes, deep passes, and Sanders running routes over the middle, routes towards the sidelines, great body control. He was simply a star out there on day one, so living up to that hype.
Matt, what do you got for Cecil?
What do I got for Cecil? Well, let's go ahead and let's ask a little bit about the running back situation here. Tell us a little bit more about who you think is going to be backing up Monte Ball, and whether or not the whole Ronnie Hillman we've made up and we're going to give you a fresh start thing now that camp is underway. How much of that was talk and how much of that is real action?
Well, it's real action, but we all know that Ronnie Hillman's a great practice player. I mean, once again, he was out there running some draw plays, doing some stuff on the outside, on the edge of the defense, and using that speed. There's no tackling, though. And that's one of the biggest differences. Once you get to where you can tackle, Ronnie Hillman, instead of avoiding contact, runs right into guys at the second level, and that's not what you want. If you're that size of back, he's never going to run through those arm tackles. So we've learned over the past couple of years when it's been, holy, shut your mouth, look at that guy in practice, and then it's a different guy when the games are live, when the tackling's live. Hillman is going to get that chance. They have Kiston made up a little bit, but I'll tell you this much: he starts dribbling the ball, a guy like Brendan Clay is going to take his job. Brendan Clay running with the first team today, and that was reported, so I can talk about it. Brendan Clay was out there in the mix with Hillman, with Ball, with C.J. Anderson as first-team backs for the Denver Broncos. And when you talk about an undrafted back from Oklahoma that could be everything that Ronnie Hillman hasn't been, I don't believe anybody's job is safe, really, 2 through 4. Nobody, even Anderson. I know Jeff Legwold started a Twitter fire when he had C.J. Anderson not on his final 53-man roster. He had Brendan Clay and Juwan Thompson and Ronnie Hillman behind Monte Ball. I obviously disagree with that. Anderson showing up at 213 pounds. He's actually the small back now in comparison to Monte, who's about 220, but his lower body's still huge, and that's where the power resides. There was a carry today where he burst through, he caught Brandon Marshall off guard, the linebacker, and got to the third level of the defense like that in the blink of an eye because of that lower body. And I've said that he probably has the quickest 10-yard burst of any back on this roster. And then even though he's 213 pounds now, he still runs with that trademark power. And when you look at, in case of emergency, break glass, if Monte Ball goes down, are you giving Ronnie Hillman 20 carries? No. Are you giving Brendan Clay, who I like? I think he's intent between the tackles, but he's not built to be a banger. Are you giving him 20 carries? No. Capri Bibbs? No. Juwan Thompson? No. Gerardus Williams? No. C.J. Anderson? Yes.
Frank
so
Gore.
Pads come on, exactly. Pads come on in just a little bit, and that's where C.J. should really shine, and I expect him to win the running back 2 job in Denver.
Cecil, I'm going to ask you about defensive stuff. I was very pleased to see that Von Miller was cleared for full contact. He's not on the PUP list, wasn't on the NFI list for conditioning issues, so that's a good sign. What are you seeing out of Von Miller? How does DeMarcus Ware look? Are those guys going to be the pass rushers that Denver needs to keep that defense doing what it expected it to do last year before all those injuries?
Yeah, and DeMarcus Ware has really changed his body to get into better shape, some MMA stuff, some yoga, etc. His waist is now like a 36, where it was a 40 last year. And we look at the elbow's near 100%. And you look at his burst off the edge. Again, no pads. We can't tell about that yet. But when we talk about getting around both Chris Clark, who was at right tackle today, mixing in with Winston Justice, and then Ryan Clady, he was getting around them both cleanly and getting some pseudo sacks. You can't touch the quarterback, but Ware was still getting into the backfield quickly. As far as Von Miller, he wasn't in team drills. He was in some 7-on-7. He did some individual work as well in individual linebacker drills and moving well laterally, like making cuts on that knee. So mentally, I think, not only is he elitely gifted physically, but I think mentally now he's over the knee injury and he's ready to go out and dominate. And him and Ware are like 2 peas in a pod and best buddies and best friends. So it's nice to see him comparing notes out there on the practice field after they make a play. This is what I'm going to do. This is what you should do. It's pretty cool to watch. So as Miller gets healthier, he'll probably get contact about week 3 of the preseason. That's when he'll actually see contact. Until then, kind of ease him in. But it's great news to have those type of pass rushers available for the Broncos.
Okay, Cecil, well, you basically set me up for it. And I know that at the end of practice today, they said that he had a minor, and we never know in training camp when they say these things, minor issue with his left foot, the same foot that was surgically repaired. I think he broke, and I don't want Dr. Gene to give me this. I think it was the 5th metatarsal. Gene's like, there isn't such thing as a 5th metatarsal. No, but our man, Cody Latimer. And, I'm starting to see it, Cease. We gushed about him. I can remember having the phone call with Matt Waldman back in February when I was like, Matt, have you watched this guy, Cody Latimer? And Matt says, oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I'm trying to hold a few back for everybody. But yeah. And now I'm seeing a lot of the Denver beat writers talking about Cody Latimer and saying, oh, yeah. So, the foot, and we were wondering how quickly he could get in the fold. I know that he came out of this with a minor foot injury. Let us know anything you might know about that, but also just how he looks like he's fitting in.
He's so good, I don't know how they keep him on the bench, honestly. It'll be difficult. if he continues to progress. And obviously got to stay healthy, become a better route runner, etc. He still rounds off some of his cuts, but I'll tell you this much. Dookie Anacho and Kayvon Webster are still out on the practice field picking up their jock because Cody Latimer beat both of them on a post over the middle, and Osweiler threw it with touch. We got to give him a lot of credit for that. Then the next pass was like in the dirt, but still, he threw it with touch. It was about, let's say, 50-yard, and it was a touchdown. Cody Latimer splitting those two guys, making them look silly, honestly, that a rookie could be that big and that swift and that fast and not a developed route runner. Then you see in the red zone, in the low red zone, something that Adam Gase is almost kind of pissed off about last year, that they had so many field goals. Well, Latimer plays above the rim, and you saw it today. Let's throw up a jump pass for Cody Latimer. How do you keep this guy off the field? Well, you've got Welker, Sanders, and Demarius, and if there is a player that's getting taken off the field, it is Cody Latimer. Now, it was Bubba Caldwell today in place of Demarius Thomas. It was Emmanuel Sanders on the other side. It was Wes Welker in the slot. Latimer comes in for Welker. He can play the slot. He can play outside with the second team. He's outside. Any first-team action, he's inside. So Sanders still staying outside as we had predicted, and still have plenty of time to go, but as we'd predicted, it could be Welker that comes off the field in favor of Latimer when they get to the low red zone.
Cecil, what is it that you feel like that fantasy owners need to watch for with the quarterback situation beyond Peyton Manning for the future when they're looking at dynasty leagues? What's the state of the depth chart beyond Peyton Manning?
It's an upheaval. I mean, now they tell you differently. I saw Evan Silva, good friend of the show from Roto World, commented on the nice value of Brock Osweiler. It's not there with Brock. I've seen regression from Brock, and I'm a big Brock believer. I was a fan of the pick for people who said they should have got an impact player, and then you'd ask them who, and they couldn't tell you. And I told them Levante David, who was the very next pick afterwards. I'm getting off track, but the point is, I've asked Fox, I've asked Gase, I've asked Elway all about Osweiler and his struggles, and each one to a man says, we're happy with his progress. We're looking at, Elway told me, we're looking at him as our future. Now, his contract's up before Manning's contract is up. And if Manning could get 3 more years, Brock's gone. And then it's a Ryan Mallett situation where it's like, well, we thought maybe we had something, and now he's just going to move on. And that may be the case with Brock Osweiler. If Brock doesn't improve, because he's looked really rough, very inconsistent. Again, throws with touch. I liked his footwork better today. That was a good thing. In mini camps and OTAs, his footwork was incredibly poor. It's almost like he regressed a year, which is unusual. If Brock doesn't progress more, honestly, I don't think the quarterback of the future is on this team. Maybe it's Bryn Renner. Renner got a few reps today, looked good and clean setting up, throws a cleaner pass and quicker out of his hand than Zach Dysert. But Dysert, he's all over the place. It's what he is. These players don't change that much. It looks like Brock's actually taken a couple of steps back. Dysert's still the same guy he is. And Renner, who we like, very smart, very accurate, still kind of an unknown.
So, Cecil, I'm going to go offensive side of the ball. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Nate Irving, but I think the guy that has me most intrigued is Sylvester Williams. It's a guy we talked about at the Senior Bowl a little bit. You, I, Josh Norris, a few others worried about how much time he spent on the ground. But I don't know that that's necessarily going to be his role for Denver. I think they'd like to see him almost in the same way that Dominique Easley or even an Aaron Donald. They want him to get up the field and pressure the quarterback and maybe be a disruptive force against the run as well. Are you seeing things from him that show he's starting to get it as a second-year player? Is he going to be more important to the middle of the run defense than guys like Nate Irving and maybe even T.J. Ward could be?
Well, I'll say this. Big Vic is back. Kevin Vickerson is healthy. He's out there on the practice field. Somewhat limited like Von Miller as he's coming back from the hip surgery after the injury he had in the Patriots game. Big Vic isn't going to let that job go without a fight when he's fully capable of running through team drills. But Sylvester Williams and Pot Roast, Terrence Knighton, are entrenched as the 2 defensive tackles. And we may see actually Knighton get a few more reps in nickel because of that sack against Brady in the playoffs. He talked about it today. It's like, talking about his glory days. Like, I sacked Brady. So that could be an option for the Broncos going forward. And Sylvester, I think he is getting it because last year at the beginning of the year, he was picking the wrong hole. He was picking the wrong Sasaki. He was picking the wrong shoulder to attack, and he was trying to run around the play. That works at North Carolina. It doesn't work in the NFL. You've got to attack the correct shoulder. He learned that, and he stopped guessing. And because of that, he was involved in more plays. So I think Sly's already started to get it. Now they're building off that. But know that, whether it's Vickerson or Williams, Mitch Unrein, and Marvin Austin, guys, I mean, he's here. He's so talented. He's just got to stay healthy and kind of get his head on straight. Marvin Austin here could push a guy like Mitch Unrein off the roster. A talent. This used to be a horrible defensive line. Now it's like the strength of the defense.
Cease, get some rest, man, and sunscreen. Always use sunscreen. And we look forward to having you filling us in on, and we got preseason watch list, filling us in on the Broncos and everything else, all the other wonderful goodness that flows from Cecil Lammey. And what a pro. I mean, you did your own safe word, and that is true professionalism. So I think that we can all be inspired by that.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. I'll be back with you soon, although I think the Broncos play on Thursday night against Seattle. So, yes, thank you, Bloom. Thank you, and I'll get you some vodka or something. Anyway, see you guys.
All right. And we get it's a luxury because like I said, I mean, he's there with John Fox, John Elway, and so on and so forth, and you are going to get it straight from the horse's mouth, from the Broncos' mouth. And of course, I'm happy. I'm happy to hear that Cody Latimer is doing everything that we thought he could already. And like I said, I saw some tweets from Broncos beat writers today that were kind of like, whoa. Hey, this Cody Latimer, yeah, he's going to be pretty good. So they're seeing what we're seeing. And I moved Cody Latimer up into my top 120 today because I just feel like he's the kind of player that I may be willing to hang on to for 6-8 weeks just to see what happens, because if he can get on the field, he can make a massive impact. Lots of massive impact news around the league.
Your mic.
My mic, yes, the microphone. And I don't know, folks, give me some, feedback if you can. If this, I'm not haven't really thought through my video setup here, and the microphone is obviously, as I've commented with Cecil's, it's obviously very phallic. It also is kind of like a spaceship, though. So maybe those two things kind of cancel each other out. Let's get to the news of the week, and I suppose and by the way, Dr. Gene he's hooking us up so well. The pup dates. I like that. Sense of humor. It's like good bedside manner. The pup dates. Who avoided pup? Who's on pup? The biggest story of those is Rob Gronkowski. Now, Gene, on one hand, you would look at this and say, well, this elevates the possibility of him playing week 1 to 95%, 97%. I mean, if they're not even bothering to reserve a roster spot while he rehabs. But on the other hand, it's the Patriots. So I don't know if we can ever say we're more sure than 80% of anything Patriots related. What was your reaction? How did you update your Gronkowski for 2014 file when you heard this?
Well, my first reaction was, what a difference from last year. All the way from April through most of September and part of October last year, we were getting weekly and sometimes multiple weekly updates about is he going to have his plate removed from his arm? What's going on with his back surgery? How that's rehab's going? Is he going to meet the 12 weeks that we expected him to there? And then we had story after story after story about our Gronk handlers holding him out a little bit longer than what the Patriots thought was going to be necessary. This year, all we got was a 1 or 2 sentence report from Bill Belichick in a press conference that said he's in pads, he's practicing, he's not going on PUP. We did hear from Gronkowski a couple times saying he was hopeful for week 1. He's hopeful he's going to play 16 games, but nothing like we heard last year. But again, as you hinted at there, I think the important part of this is by not putting him on the PUP list, the Patriots have closed the door to anything other than carrying him on the active 53-man roster, and if he's not ready, inactivating him like they did at times last year, or if things don't go well in camp or he has even a minor setback, the only option they have is to put him on the designated to return list and leave him out for 8 games. So they closed a couple of big doors by not putting him on that list and allowing him to practice so early. And lots of teams will stash veterans if they don't pass a conditioning test, they just don't like the way they look. Those guys will go on the NFI list or the PUP list, and they'll make them work out for a week until they're ready. The Patriots, by doing this, I think, say that, A, their medical staff doesn't have any concerns about Gronkowski being ready for week 1, and 2, that he's ready to go now, that he's in condition to take hits and pads. And I think that's really important. That suggests that for a guy that had an ACL repair a little bit late because they wanted the MCL to heal, and all of the issues that he went through last year, with this, we're talking 6 months at this point. I mean, this is Adrian Peterson-like in terms of being ready for camp early. Those are very good signs. Now, that doesn't mean that Gronkowski's going to look like himself in the first couple of preseason weeks, that he's going to take back-to-back practices, or even that he'll look like himself in the first month of the season. But this is, compared to how this could have gone, with us wondering, is he going to come off the PUP list week by week by week during the preseason, and not seeing him take any practice, and possibly, we may still not see him play in any preseason games. I think he'll probably get some preseason time. But compared to what we could have been talking about today, which is what we would have been talking about last year, when is he going to come off the PUP list, if at all? This is huge news for Gronkowski, and it's nothing but positive, even though, yes, we've had issues with Patriots not being forthcoming with all the information that we'd have liked them to give us a good. And we're not reading tea leaves here. We're not guessing. We're not doubting. They have every indication that he'll be ready for the active 53 in week 1, and that's huge news 6 or 7 weeks ahead of time.
Okay, speaking of huge, Matt, I was doing another revision. I put auction values up today, PPR auction values at footballguys.com. So I did a revision before I got that out fresh, and I'll keep those updated as I make more revisions. But Matt, when I put together my top 10 for PPR leagues, I mean, it's pretty simple. You got your 4 running backs, you've got Graham, you've got Calvin Johnson, and I put Gronkowski. I mean, I thought about it, and if I'm on the board at number 7, and these 6 guys are gone. And right now, actually, we're doing a Football Guys slow draft, mock draft, 12-team PPR classic setup, and we're doing a slow draft. You can follow with hashtag FBGMock, and we're giving a little bit of commentary on every pick. And I was almost there. I was picking 6, and I took Calvin Johnson. I had to think about Gronkowski. Graham went 5th. I'm becoming well known now as the guy who's like, I did a mock auction with the Roto World guys, and I got Gronkowski for $40 out of the 200. And as soon as it was over, everyone was like, "Yeah, Bloom. There's no way anybody but Bloom was getting Gronkowski." Am I delusional, or is number 7 not too high for Gronk now?
It's not too high. I mean, I think that certainly when you take a look at what Gronkowski can do and where the state of the wide receiver core is in New England, that you have to realize that Gronkowski is basically the passing game for that team. And when he isn't healthy, Tom Brady was just a little bit below average as a fantasy quarterback, not as an NFL quarterback, as a fantasy quarterback. When you get Gronkowski in that mix, suddenly now you have a lot of matchup advantages, makes Tom Brady's life easier. He's able to execute a little bit better and dictate mismatches in a way that he isn't able to do when he has Michael Huamwani or Hoo or whatever we call him nowadays. But that's right. So but anyways, I certainly think that whether it's Graham, Gronkowski, or next year if Jordan Cameron makes that list, then I'm sure that you will be coming up with a draft strategy for 3 tight ends in the first 4 rounds of fantasy drafts, and feeling pretty good about that with those guys. But I think you actually do have a very good sound logic about picking one of the 2 top tight ends, especially in a PPR league. So I think that's very worthwhile.
So the landscape has changed. The days of getting Gronk, I was getting him in the 3rd in some drafts, maybe late 2nd. That's over. Expect him to go in the mid, maybe even early 2nd, and don't be surprised if he goes. And I think our own Kean Fahey, who I know is awake, even though we don't have him in here tonight, because he's telling me that I was breathing. Sorry, everybody. I'm still getting used to this microphone. Cecil tells me you have to stay close, like really close to it. So even when I'm not talking, and then you're it's carpet scrubbing, as somebody said. So now we're going to stick with a lot of medical news, and because that's the open of training camp. Often you'll hear we get this wave of news of guys that maybe are coming in hurt that we find out about, or we see how far along they really are. And again, Dr. Jene gives you that update, the pup date, and just know that this kind of insight is just one of many things you're going to get with your Football Guys Insider Pro subscription. And again, I want to take a moment to say, if you aren't ready to take that plunge yet, get our magazine online, 200 plus articles constantly updated, or get the mobile draft dominator. It speaks for itself. You will get free training camp updates if you use the Cloud Sync feature. You'll get a taste of what Football Guys does, which is if you just give us a little bit, we'll give you much more than you could ever expect for that. Part of that is Dr. Jene, and it's kind of orientation. You had an article, Jene, a week ago, the training camp entry storylines, and now we're starting to get some chapters written in those storylines. Next one is Julio Jones, and he's been cleared to practice. And when I speak again, Gene, putting it in terms of redoing rankings, constantly revisiting rankings. Every time, I know that in theory I should be moving Julio down a little bit because of the uncertainty, but I just can't do it. It just doesn't feel like I know that in a formalistic way, I should wait until we really see him full speed. But it just feels like everything is going one after another in the right order, that I'm not moving him down at all right now because of this foot issue. Is that kind of sticking my head in the sand?
No, I don't think so. I've been optimistic on Julio pretty much from the beginning. I think, despite what was in that Atlanta Journal-Constitution article that said this was a new procedure, that there's groundbreaking work going on with Julio Jones, my read of what he had done and the details in that article look very similar to that journal article we were talking about from Dr. Anderson. I think there's good indication and good data that suggests that Jones is going to do fine after this. Is that a guarantee? No. But it's not the same as microfracture surgery 15 years ago or certain types of back surgery or spinal stenosis where you're just not sure what you're going to get. I think there wasn't ever any indication that Anderson didn't like what he saw when he put Jones back together. There's not been any indication this offseason that Jones wasn't progressing well through his rehab. I'm not really worried that much about the foot. Yeah, it's possible that we get into an Ahmad Bradshaw, Emmanuel Sanders type of situation where there's another issue with the screw or there's some other issue with that bone or someplace else and around that area of the foot, but I'm pretty optimistic that that's not the case. What I do think we need to worry about is how he's going to transition from being in good athletic condition to being in football-related condition in pads, and the Falcons are trying to manage that appropriately by limiting his reps early in camp. And in this situation, I don't think that's a bad thing because he really wasn't doing much in OTAs. So let's make sure that he's up to speed, that he's in as good a condition or not better. Julio's condition is different than the 70th, the 80th guy on the roster this time of year. Let's make sure he's in Julio football condition and then gradually let him get out there so that we don't see a hamstring strain, a groin pull, a calf injury, or something like that. And if he gets through these next couple of weeks without one of those, and they're comfortable putting him in the lineup by the second week of preseason or third week of preseason, and I expect that's what we'll see, then there's even though this was an injury that required surgery and we weren't exactly sure what we were going to get, and we know it was a recurrent injury from the past, I'm not too concerned about this. And again, I think, based on what I wrote about a month ago, I think we've got good data to support that. So again, no guarantee, but I wouldn't be dropping Julio down my list either. I think, if your determination is that offense can support good numbers for Julio, and there's no reason it can't, then you rank him where you rank him.
Okay, and before we get Matt's take on Julio, actually, and he's in the Atlanta metro area, so that's going to be golden. He watched every game of the Falcons last year, in part for Football Guys. I want to revisit Gronk really quickly. I forgot about this because I got a question on Twitter, and one of the really fun things about doing this is, and this is not going to surprise any of you, that when I was in high school, I did something called Academic League, the classic quiz bowl, and I had a rival. I was Bentworth. He was from Best Center. We were rivals. We clashed, but it was all respect. It was all love, And Joe Wright, I want to give a shout out to Joe, who I think is an attorney, not a Dorman attorney like me. But he wanted to know, and this is a good question, because Gene, when the Gronk news came out, there I am. This is why I'm getting a reputation for being so zealous about him, defending his honor, And I know I even pulled you in a little bit to that, and I'm sorry if that made you uncomfortable. But we can dismiss not truly dismissed, but the knee injury, the arm injury, those were more like freak injuries, or injuries that weren't based on his physiology or playing style or something that is directly there's some causation on his part. But the back injury, what about his back history? Kind of on a scale from 1 to 10, how much should we worry that it would cause him to miss games this year, and how much should we worry that it would shorten his career?
I'd be more worried about the second of those than the first. So even if it's been successfully repaired, disc issues like that, and Gronkowski has been through 2 of them, it's degenerative, right? So, and we've seen tight ends in the past have issues with this. We've seen offensive linemen have issues with this. So guys that are dependent on blocking sometimes or take lots of hits, and Gronkowski's a very physical player, is his career likely to be a little bit shorter than it would have been had he not had these back issues? I think it's reasonable to make that argument. Will that actually happen? I don't know. We saw him come back and play very well after recovering from that back surgery last year before the ACL. So I don't know that in this particular year we have to worry about that. And we can have an extended discussion about injury prone if you like. We've hashed that out a number of times. But yeah, so to me, the arm injury, probably flukish. The knee injury, lots and lots of players that got hit on the knee in that fashion probably would have had an ACL, MCL injury with that foot planted. There's really nothing he could have done. You just can't react quickly enough to keep your foot from sticking in the turf at that point and your knee going the other way. That's just what happens when you get hit by a 200, 225-pound guy with your knee in that particular position. So I think you're right to point out that the thing that's we probably ought to be most concerned about from a prone to future injury question is the back problem. But I think he proved to us last year that he can recover from something like that. And yes, before he had that procedure, there were indications that he'd been trying to play through it for a number of months before. It cost him a lot of time and probably some draft position because he had that issue in college. So it's something that should be on the back of everybody's mind. But again, I short of knowing exactly what he's feeling in the moment and exactly what his imaging studies look like, which we're never going to know, I don't think that's something that we can put a percentage risk on. What we know is that he looked good after his procedure last year before the ACL.
And he did. It took 3 weeks, really. 3 weeks once he was on the field, and he was good old Gronk. Okay, going back to Julio Jones, Matt. And what's interesting here is, and this is probably part of the reason that I find it hard to move Jones down my board too far while we wait to have resolution on this foot. If you go back and look last year, before he went down, I believe he was the #1 fantasy receiver, Julio Jones. And he's one of these guys that, early on in his career, everyone's putting chips down on him because this is going to be the year. This is going to be the year. And last year, before the foot, it really was. I mean, he looked magnificent in those first 5 games, and the numbers backed it up. So, do you consider him at this moment in that Dez and Demaryius Thomas tier? Again, folks, the gut check 2 weeks ago, terrific PPR tiers. Where does Julio fit? Mute.
Sorry. Looking at Gronk gifs of him spiking the ball and thinking about putting him up here, but decided against it. Yeah. I have Julio Jones in my top 5, and that's probably the highest I've ever had him since he's entered the league. And I'd still say that despite the fact that I have him that high, I actually have him probably at where I think his absolute upside is for this team, which is at 85 receptions, about 1,350 yards, and 10 touchdowns. I know he had an amazing set of games, and the stats back up that he looked like he's capable of, becoming that top 5 player, and I certainly have him at the edge of that. But let's look at context too, and part of the context is that Roddy White wasn't Roddy White last year, especially during that period of the season, and the Falcons weren't running their offense the way that they like to run it. And that's a lot of quick hitting passes, a lot of precision plays to Roddy White, a lot of working off play action in the run game to be able to hit a lot of these quick passes and move the chains. And when you don't have a running back who's healthy, who can do that, or your only precision route running, all around great receiver who's, in Roddy White, then you have to go downfield and play up for grabs with Julio Jones or let him do his magic after the catch. It's not that Julio Jones is a bad player or not as talented as Roddy White. He's just a different style player. And I don't think you're going to get Roddy White type of plays out of Julio Jones, while at the same time you can get some Julio Jones type of plays out of Roddy White. Not as many, not the same quality, but enough that if Jones went down, Roddy White's going to keep this offense afloat if he's healthy, whereas doing a variety of things. Whereas I think with Julio Jones, you may get the numbers, but the offense may not be in as good a shape. So the way I look at this is that, yeah, Jones, 85, 1350, 10 as a stat line for the year, very good, top 5 worthy, but I think that that's the upside for him. I don't see him being the number 1 receiver in the league this year. And I think it would take maybe a couple years before, say, Roddy White goes, retires, and this team has to lean even harder on Jones. And I still don't believe Jones is the type of receiver that you would look to be that guy. Kind of the way Vincent Jackson isn't looked to being that type of guy in any offense. I think Julio Jones is a slightly more physically talented version of Vincent Jackson.
Yeah, so you're saying he's a bad player?
Yes. Yes, to all Falcons fans.
After all that,
that's all I'm saying. Yeah, and I'm sure that's what's going to come out. That's how it's going to come out.
No. And it's funny. It was just more that note in your voice, like, because Vincent Jackson is a fantastic player. Yeah, he's just Vincent Jackson.
He's just Vincent Jackson. But in fantasy football terms, that just Vincent Jackson is, low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2.
Right. Some people will challenge you to a duel after they hear you say that.
I'm sure they will. But
how dare you?
Yeah, get out the white gloves, and they're gonna.
Exactly. I was gonna do the slash.
Yeah.
You're a good Southern gentleman now, right, Matt? So we're. So while we're on the subject of the Atlanta receivers, let's just touch on this really quick, Matt. Roddy White did get that extension, 1 or 2 players to get an extension this week. Not that I was worried about him or downgrading him at all, but, again, going back to this split, Julio's going in the late first, early second. Roddy's going in the 4th. Is this an all systems go, wave the green flag, treat Roddy like you've always treated him? Because obviously the Falcons are.
Well, our good doctor's a little more cautious. I remember we talked about him last week, and he's a little more cautious with that, and I think it's probably for good reason. But if you're more on the side of, I'm just assuming everything's going to be okay and just hoping and praying in denial like I am, then I would probably say, yeah, all systems go for White. I have White as the 11th ranked receiver and the much better value to Julio Jones, because the only difference between them in my projections is 100 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's it. So as long as White's good to go and he's healthy enough, and Gene looks at him and says, he's still running those timing routes pretty well with good explosion and turn, then I'm not lowering him in my projections. But if Gene's like, I'm not quite sure if Roddy White has that extra step back that he lost while he had the high ankle sprain, then I might be more prone to drop him down my rankings. And I'm actually being serious about that.
Sure.
Because Gene would know and he'd see. But the way I see it right now is, all systems go with him. These are the 2 guys who are going to carry that passing game. And, there's going to be some charity points to Harry Douglas and maybe a bone here and there to Levine Toilolo. And, the rest is going to be leaning really heavy on these 2 outside receivers.
Matt, I'm just picturing the 3 of us watching an Atlanta preseason game, week 3, in the RSP film room with, Gene and you and I, and Roddy White runs his first timing route, and we're sitting there like, what'd you think? Gene, what'd you think? Gene goes, he looks all right. Yay!
Didn't we do that with Brock Osweiler once upon a time?
We did. But it was
on Joe's couch.
Yes. Yeah.
Somebody was trying to tell me he looked like Peyton Manning. Who was that?
I do have to say this. The last time I've watched a Falcons football game with a friend of mine on television was a very long time ago, and it was a preseason game, and my friend was going, an Alabama fan, was going on and on and on about this backup quarterback from Southern Miss who told me all these, like, just unbelievable, like, tall tales about playing with his intestines all messed up from a car accident, and he's like, you got to watch this guy, and yeah, we know that what happened after that.
Yeah, we know we're old.
He's all right. Did your friend sucker punch you and say "Roll Tide"?
We've probably sucker punched each other a number of times, and I think that was probably the year that Alabama beat the University of Miami, and we had that kind of rivalry going back and forth during college. So it was all good times. Oklahoma drills in the hallway, probably.
You're a real turncoat. I mean, being a Miami Hurricane in the middle of Georgia. In the middle of SEC country, so
I went to school there, man. What are you going to tell? You know,
I'm just saying. Well, no,
I may not be an alum,
exactly.
but
I understand. No. I'm just saying it's just funny because it's definitely not an SEC country kind of school. But we're getting way off topic here. Okay.
Yeah.
And I want to. There's not really much to say. I just want to mention it in case you didn't hear that Jamal Charles held out for, I don't know, a couple of hours. I don't know how long it was, but he did get a bump. And it was a classic thing where, like, the agents put the reports out of what the extension is or the new contract is, and then when they report the actual numbers, they aren't quite as good. But the bottom line is Charles held out, and Charles got more money. So, you know, our man, all route that action, boss, Marshawn Lynch, this my son, said, and through Michael Robinson, this is what's neat, you know, going back to the Super Bowl, Michael Robinson is clearly like his spokesperson, and broke it live on the air that he is going to hold out. I guess, Matt, I'll ask you first because we share such a love for Marshawn Lynch. At what point, and I've ended up with Marshawn Lynch on a lot of my MFL 10 teams, so I'm sweating a little bit. At what point do you start to change Lynch's projections, Michael's projections? Did you already? Is this something that you are going to err on the side of underreacting to or overreacting to?
Well, I'm going to underreact for the next 10 days. And then we're going to see what happens during that 10-day period and how that transpires. To me, the joke, and I'm only half kidding here, is that when you mention Michael Robinson, whenever I see Michael Robinson interviewing Marshawn Lynch won't say a word to him, never says anything. The whole episode, the whole series is a joke about how he can't get Marshawn Lynch to even speak to him on camera. So the fact that Lynch even spoke to him on camera to announce his holdout is fairly big news in itself. So really, when you look at this, it is something to be a little bit concerned by, because you look at the depth of the Seattle running backs, and they have some good players. They have some guys that, if you put them all together and let them do their work as a threesome there of Turbin, Michael, and even Spencer Ware.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And Spencer Ware to me is the most, I've heard people echo this on Twitter, but I've mentioned this in the RSP blog last year. He's the most Marshawn Lynch-like of the backs, and really reminded me a lot of Lynch before they even drafted him. So you look at the situation, and there's not a lot of bargaining power for his age, for the strength of the Seahawk team, and for the fact that they have some youth and depth on that depth chart to pay him the kind of money that he's probably asking for. And with the Seahawks so much about competition and putting the best product out on the field there, there's a compelling element here where Lynch might be asking for too much. At the same time, there were probably times when the Dallas Cowboys with Emmitt Smith were thinking the same exact thing after they won a Super Bowl, and Smith is, of course Smith was in his prime, but Lynch could arguably still be in his prime too, because of the fact that he had a couple of off years in Buffalo where he was sitting on the bench for much of his career, and might have a couple more really strong years in him. The problem is where does it, as a team, where do you bite the bullet and pay the extra money because you have a special player? And I do think that Marshawn Lynch is probably, if you're looking at a franchise caliber player, he's not there, but I would say you can make an argument that he's one of the more underrated players that we have seen in terms of special running backs in the past 10 years. he's probably one of the most underrated players, and I think that it'll be a hard argument for him to make. So the next 10 days, see what's said back and forth. If it drags on a little bit more, we know that Lynch is good with his conditioning and his work ethic. So I think, at least we've seen that over the past 5 years. So if that happens, if he continues to hold out, you have to be somewhat cautious in dropping him down due to just maybe not being in, quote, football shape and getting that all the, kind of the banging on there in training camp at the level that you would get at least one time a day. So it's one of those things that I would cautiously back away from my optimism over the next 10 to 14 days if this continues.
Okay, and if I had a better Kean Fahey accent, I almost want to toss this to Gene and get Kean has a question for you, Matt, about this, and I almost want to toss this to Gene and have Gene ask it in his best Kean voice, but I'm not going to do that to you tonight. It's going to be another time when you least expect it, Gene. So I won't play with this one.
You can do it to me, but I need to hear it before it's one of those things where no. I need to hear the accent.
You
for
need
a little bit first. Yeah,
it's like shapeshift.
Flip into it easily.
Yeah, exactly. You need to absorb it like a chameleon. Okay, so he wants to know if you have any concerns, and I think this is something worth pointing out just as a general football interesting point, that Seattle's offensive line has been at times pretty brutal. And Keane wants to know if you have any concerns about the other backs, how they would perform behind the offensive line.
I would if there were injuries that were a factor, like there were last year as well. And they've had injury issues over the past couple of years with that line. So that would be a reason that you would look at some of these backs and they have less experience in the NFL. And that's where Marshawn Lynch really shines, because he is a smart back and a very decisive one and knows how to really use his agility at a level where it's not just look how athletic I am. It's really how do I use my physical skills in context to gain yardage. And I think that Christine Michael has the potential to become that type of player, but like C.J. Spiller, like LaShawn McCoy, like Jamal Charles, hasn't probably put it all together just yet. We don't have proof that he's going to be consistent enough in some of the, on a play-to-play basis where he's going to avoid some of the mistakes that young players do, because Christine Michael could go two routes. He could become, the next Amon Green with a little bit more agility and, similar type of speed and power, or he could, if he really went off the deep end the opposite direction, he could be the next Lawrence Maroney, who dances his way out of the league in addition to other things off the field. But, that was part of Maroney's problem. Maroney was a terrific talent. So there is some concern with that, but I think especially even with a Robert Turbin, who might not be the most mature runner when he came out of school, but if there's a runner that I like out of that group in terms of maturity and understanding of how to hit the hole and make the most of what's in front of him, it's going to be Spencer Ware, even though he may not be as physically talented. So I think they'd find somebody out of those three to probably do good enough work, and then they would lean a little bit more in the passing game with Russell Wilson, and I think Russell Wilson is ready at this stage to be able to take it up an extra notch. He's not maybe in the elite tier of quarterbacks at this stage, but I think that he's able to elevate his game enough that Matt Stafford type of numbers where he's knocking on that type of door.
Okay, Gene, and this almost goes sort of like the injury-prone label. We have a continuum here. At one end of the continuum would be something like superstition, or past results do not guarantee future performance. And the other end of the spectrum is it's sound reasoning, and there are definitely some things at play here that make this the smart approach, and it's not just mixing up correlation and causation, and it is about holdouts. And it seems like the conventional wisdom is when a player holds out, like Matt said, and this is how I approach it too, there's a threshold. A 1 week holdout, a 10-day holdout, we don't really say that much. Maybe even for a veteran, a holdout to the end of training camp, they just didn't want to go to training camp that year. That's okay. But it feels like when holdouts go well into August, it does have an effect on the player's fantasy performance and overall performance during the season. So tell us about whether that is a sound story to tell about why to avoid these holdout players, and then how that would specifically apply to Lynch based on what we know about him.
Yeah, I'd like to avoid any more references to Lawrence Moroney, please.
Moni, that one goes out to Woodrow.
Burned me many, many times. Thanks, Matt, for ripping open that old wound. I think this situation is probably a little bit different with Marshawn Lynch than the other ones we've seen in the past. Maybe it's similar in some ways, but the first thought that came to my mind when I heard about this is he serious? If Lynch is serious, I don't see Seattle breaking down and giving him Jamal Charles type money. So this could go on for a while, and we may know that within 2 or 3 days. I mean, if we hear enough from Lynch or Robinson that makes us think that Lynch is in this for the longer haul for whatever reason, we'll know if that's the case or not. I'm not exactly sure what's behind this, but if this goes more than 3 or 4 days, this is something that could go on for 3 or 4 weeks without too much difficulty. I don't really see Marshawn Lynch as a guy who is just taking weeks off of training camp to be taking weeks off of training camp. So if it does go to that length of time and Kristen Michael looks good early in camp, or the other guys that we've talked about look like capable producers, and that offense is clicking without him, who blinks and when? I don't know that I see Seattle blinking unless that running back depth chart looks not good or there's an injury. So I'm with Matt. I don't even know that I would give it 10 days. I think if this is still going on by the middle of next week, it might be time to worry about just how long is this going to go.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. I mean, the whole "is he serious" thing just gets us into. We try. I mean, this is like some of the most amateur. We do a lot of amateur. Well, I won't say we. I'll just speak for myself. Do a lot of amateur speculation and filling in blanks, and like I say, peeking through keyholes. But part of what we do is trying to simulate. Okay, what's he thinking? What are the dynamics here? When are the scales going to tip to one side or the other? But with Marshawn Lynch, we can't ever really know how all the circuits connect up in his head and what makes him go. And this was something, again, going back to the Super Bowl, on display during the Super Bowl, and the wild, polarizing reactions that Marshawn Lynch just being Marshawn Lynch generated. And because of that, I can't say with certainty, when the retirement stuff came up earlier this offseason, and people were like, 100%, no way, never, ever, ever, ever will that happen. That's Marshawn. I don't know what Marshawn Lynch is. A different dude, man. I mean, there's nothing that I would say is 100% about him. So this is going to be one to watch because, I mean, obviously everyone's been licking their lips, salivating about a potential Kristen Michael larger role this year. And even if Lynch just holds out well into August, that in and of itself could open the door to that, even when Lynch shows up. And we'll see. Yeah.
You know what? I think we make too much out of Lynch here. I don't think Lynch is that unpredictable. I just think he's an introvert who doesn't care what people think. And he's just his own guy, and he's just kind of an introverted guy in a world, in a media that expects everyone to be extroverted and to be straight-laced on top of that. And if they aren't, then and they do little things like that, then they want him to be Flavor Flav instead of just be himself. And I think that that's the thing. He talked about retirement. We can totally see him retiring. Running back's a punishing position. We just saw Sidney Grace retire. So, when I look at this, it's kind of more of this is just media reacting because some of them don't know the difference between introverts and extroverts and don't really care because they just want to get a story and they say, tell me about this, rather than ask a question.
Do you have a sense of how this has gone, Matt, over the past few hours anything that makes you lean one way or the other about whether or not he may be a little bit more serious with this and this could last a little bit? Do you think this is closer to his retirement consideration talk in the past, or is this more?
Yeah, I think so. I'm talking out of the side of my head at this point, or another part of my body. But it's the type of thing that we've seen him pretty much be the type of guy that says what he means. He curses on camera and goes oops, and then just keeps doing it anyway. He refuses to show up to media things and basically says, this is how I am, this is who I am. I think he's a fairly straightforward guy that people just don't understand because he's not playing their game, he's playing his own game. And I think that as a result of that, if he said, I'm thinking about retiring, and then camp comes around, and now he wants to hold out. Maybe he's thinking, you know what? If they're not going to pay me a little bit more, and I don't have a little bit more incentive to do this, I've won my championship. I've thought about retiring before. Maybe it's time for me to go on top, especially as I'm seeing a lot of my teammates and seeing guys that I've played with in the past, or guys that I watched if I watched football at all. Again, I'm making an assumption here if he was a big football fan, but guys that he watched who, can't feed themselves, can't, having issues with their health long term, and thinking maybe it's time for me to step away.
Yeah, and really, and I agree with you, Matt. I'm glad that you reined me in a little bit. I'm not trying to say that he's just this enigma and he's the most mysterious man in the world. But when we try to piece this together, I mean, with Charles, he signed an extension in 2010. He was due $3.9 million. And also, Charles, I mean, I know Lynch was an integral part of the Seattle Seahawks, maybe the most important offensive player in some ways. But Charles was, I mean, he was the only other legitimate answer than Peyton Manning if you were talking MVP last year. And Lynch was due $5 million this year, and he signed his contract in 2012. And I remember in 2012 when he signed it, a lot of people were like, really? Well, that's a little bit risky, but I get it. And it was a very generous contract at the time. So it just seems like Charles had much greater grounds, and obviously the Chiefs' reaction reinforces that. Where with Lynch, it goes again back to Dr. Gene's reaction. Like, is he serious? Because it's not. I mean, everybody can see it's not going to work. So you have to wonder if maybe he just needs someone to advise him. Like, look, this is not going to result in anything good for you. If it's about taking some time off, which doesn't make. I think he loses like $30,000 a day or something like that. So you're just trying to piece this together. And what is he thinking? I don't know.
Well, Charles, I'm glad you brought up Charles because, when you look at this, to make an analogy, if this were like a horse and wagon, Marshawn Lynch would be like the expert driver who knows the terrain and knows all the issues with the horse and all the kinks with the wheels and the wagon and all that kind of stuff. But Jamal Charles to the Chiefs is the horse and the wagon and the driver. And Andy Reid is sitting there in the back going, our whole thing, I'm going to be left out here in the wilderness, and I'm not too fond of bears.
Right. Was Kansas City on the Oregon Trail? It'd be like, you have contracted dysentery. Your whole team has died. Anybody? Yeah, it's a certain. We're dating ourselves here, right? But that would be the case if they didn't have Jamal Charles. And to go from a somewhat lighthearted note to something that's a little bit somber, and you mentioned it, Matt. It's the perfect segue about seeing your teammates, seeing football players decide that I'm ready to walk away, it's just not worth it. It's always a little bit sad to see a player's career end before his time. And I think that when we heard Sidney Rice was retiring yesterday, it felt that way. It felt like, this was a player that, especially back at South Carolina, but certainly in his year with Brett Favre, even at times in the last few years with Seattle, a beautiful player, just a gorgeous, almost like transcendent levitation in the air, and just playing the ball. Like, he's one of the ultimate my ball mentality guys. If you say, what's my ball mentality? Sidney Rice, that's my ball mentality. But he retires because of concussions, Gene. And what's interesting to me about this is Rice did have a season ended by concussions in 2012. Last year, it was an ACL tear. So I guess my question is, because, Gene, we've had some off-air conversations about this, about what players do we just have maybe permanently in the concussion danger zone? What players do we have at least temporarily in the concussion danger zone, and we don't know exactly what we're going to, a year's time or a season, something may kind of rehabilitate their concussion danger zone status. Is this something that we may continue to see, players retiring seemingly out of nowhere? Once they get to that point where the concussions have gotten serious enough to prematurely end a season or to put them out for an extended period of time, that maybe at some point in the future it may cause, the scales to tip and for them to say, it's not worth it.
Yeah, I think Sidney Rice may have had a little bit of football left in him, but I don't think we've seen a player who's arguably at the prime of his career retire from a concussion-type injury other than Javid Best. So, I think we're going to see it happen a little bit more often, but Sidney Rice had hip issues. He had some other stuff going on as well. So, yes, concussions are probably the reason he stepped away from the game today, but, he wasn't a lock to play a huge number of snaps for Seattle. Now, he may have proven himself ready and able to do that, but, again, we're going to see some of this going forward. As you said, I don't know that Sidney Rice is a great example of a guy who's walking away from, a big contract, a lot of playing time. He is walking away from, even if he's the fifth or sixth wide receiver on the roster, this is a Super Bowl caliber club, obviously, defending Super Bowl champion. So he's walking away from a chance at a ring, possibly. But, I don't know that he fits that particular category yet, but I think you're right. It's coming. Players that I would say that it may be in that category that would be at risk of an extended absence, I think two come to mind immediately, Wes Welker and Jordan Reed. There are probably some others out there as well. We might see that from a guy like Cecil Shorts, a few other players as well, Carlos Dunlap on the defensive side of the ball. There's going to be those guys out there that the medical staffs are very likely to look at them a little bit more cross-eyed, for lack of a better word, just to make absolute sure that they're not seeing any subtle symptoms, and they may decide to give them another week just because they've had such a history of recurrence. Hopefully we don't see that with Jordan Reed. He's got to be at the top of the list, but Wes Welker isn't far behind.
Yeah, and you brought up Java Best as an example, and what's the contrast here is that Best, it seemed like, wanted to keep playing, and the doctors wouldn't let him play.
Correct.
So this continues to be, I mean, I know the concussion settlement happened, but for fantasy football and for football in general, this continues to be a very large issue looming for individual players and for the game. But, Matt, let's get back to our game, to fantasy football, because we've got your E guy, if I could do that and say you have a guy that you're going yee about this year, Paul Richardson. We've got Jermaine Kearse. And as you said, don't forget about Doug Baldwin. I mean, we do have to talk about, and like Gene said, it's not like Sidney Rice was going to play a massive role in this offense, but he was going to play a role. He had the chemistry and the big play role. Now we have, and let's go ahead and bring in something from the Lynch story. We could even have this, potentially supercharged for these quote-unquote role players, because number one, Percy Harvin does not usually stay healthy. And number two, if Marshawn Lynch is subject of a long holdout or diminished quality, maybe you do see, as you said, Russell Wilson taking on more of the offense, or maybe just because Russell Wilson's in his third year as a starter and ready for it, he takes on more of the offense. So we've kind of thought about Seattle's passing game as not necessarily fertile soil to farm fantasy value, but when you saw Sidney Rice retired, is there any one of the three receivers that you said, okay, I'm going to go back and look at my projections and rethink this?
Well, what I ended up doing is that I had it projected where there was a fairly even split among Paul Richardson, Doug Baldwin, and Jermaine Kearse before Rice retired. And Rice was going to be the second leading receiver still, in my mind, in terms of what I had to project him for, unless I was going to say he's only going to play half the season, which is a viable reason to say, viable reason to make there if you're not a believer in Rice staying healthy over the past few years. But I didn't have it that way. I had an even split among those three, kind of for third place there. After Rice retired, I kind of had it where I just upped the split from Rice's numbers between Baldwin and Kearse, because I actually had Richardson a little bit higher than Baldwin and Kearse already. The reason I feel that way is that, as I've talked about before about Paul Richardson on our draft shows, and I'm sure that some of you are kind of late to the party with that, now that fantasy season is starting. Richardson is a terrific route runner, and he's certainly a player that the Seahawks have talked about, from the get-go when they drafted him in the second round, that they saw him as a first-round talent and were prepared to take him in the first round when they traded back with Minnesota. In case Minnesota, the deal didn't go through, they were going to go ahead and take Richardson first. And they said he could do it all. They loved his route running. They think that he's going to become a complete player that can do pretty much everything you ask of a receiver. He's not just a deep threat. And as a result of that, I think that they're going to hope that Richardson can accelerate his development to a level that they can use him a little bit more. But really, when you look at this team, I think they're going to proceed the way they planned from the beginning, which is they're going to take their young players and do what they've done in the past. We can go ahead and put them in positions where we know they're going to succeed and get them on the field early, but they're going to be in optimal situations. And I think for Paul Richardson, that means a lot more deeper routes and some perimeter routes. And then with guys like, Baldwin and Kearse, you're going to see them get a little bit more because they're familiar with the offense and more familiar with the league. And I think what you may see is a little bit more Kevin Norwood into this mix, who is an interesting player in his own right and can provide some of that Sidney Rice type of physical ability, even though he is not as athletically gifted as Sidney Rice. He's not as far away as a lot of people think. He's a very graceful player in the air, and he does make a number of really tough catches.
And also, Chris Matthews is there too, another big, rangy receiver. So that'll be something to watch. Certainly, a lot of questions in Seattle right now that we're going to be watching. And I guess this is one of those things where when you win the Super Bowl, the football gods just seem to say it's not going to be easy the second time around. Not that it ever is, but they certainly don't seem to give Super Bowl winning teams any breaks. I do want to go back and use some of Gene's pup dates again as a jumping off point, just to talk about the medical situation, but also the fantasy situations here. And this is one that we've talked about, and we don't necessarily. This is a jumping off point also to something that I didn't ask you about, Matt, when we talked about your projections on the couch, but I think this is an opportunity to do it. And we've talked about David Wilson a lot and his situation a lot. But Gene, I just want, for those people out there who aren't getting your updates or otherwise, we can just give it to him right now. What's the bottom line here with David Wilson being cleared as far as his fantasy value? Do you just move him right back up to maybe the second round, but you move him up to an optimistic position, or is this still something where, okay, it's progress, it's a step forward, but hold back on any sort of gushing optimism?
Yeah, I think we'd like to see him get through a couple of weeks of practice without any trouble. But what you do with David Wilson, I think, probably depends more on what you think of Rashad Jennings, or as much as what you think of Rashad Jennings as you do David Wilson. Him being cleared for practice after this last MRI is now confirmation that what he said last month, that they were just waiting for the fusion, the bony part of the fusion, the procedure he had in his neck, to fully fuse, to heal, that's happened. And and that made a lot of sense. He was still within that time frame. It wasn't too late to be considering that. They'd allowed him to work out, run, practice, take handoffs in a helmet and shoulder pads. So I think universally it was expected he'd be cleared. So I think that's a good sign, similar to what we talked about with Rob Gronkowski, what we could talk about with Arian Foster and Tony Romo, and maybe even a little bit of Des Bryant somewhere in the future. All of these degenerative back conditions carry with them some risk, but these we've seen time and time again, successful procedures when guys are cleared to come back for contact, they generally do pretty well. And Wilson was immediately installed as the number 2 running back behind Jennings. He's up above Andre Williams and a couple other guys they have there. So if you're of the opinion that Rashad Jennings is not a running back 2 or better, and that a healthy David Williams behind an improved offensive line is going to get a chance to do what we hoped we were going to see from him at the beginning of the season last year, then yeah, I think you can trust him right away as a running back 3 with upside, with the potential to either drop or move up a little bit depending on what happens in camp. But with so many of these guys, we're very early in training camp. There's still the potential for lots of soft tissue stuff to happen with these guys as they get back into football conditioning. Move them up a little bit because they've been cleared, and it's a good sign that nobody's enough concerned about their particular injury to hold them out of camp practices at this point. But I still think we need to give them some time to prove to their teams and that they're going to get the number of reps that they deserve, or more than what we're hearing that they're getting already. And that goes for Julio, that goes for David Wilson, lots of other guys along the way.
Okay, so we don't necessarily have to. You can open it up if you want. We don't have to get into the whole thorny issue of injury prone, but a couple of players this week certainly made people who buy into injury prone in all of its facets say, yeah, there is such a thing as a truly injury-prone player, in that we can say, this is what's happened in the past, and I feel reasonably confident that that same thing is going to happen in the future. We had 2 of them already. Jonathan Stewart now apparently had a hamstring issue from a week or 2 ago. It was like a week or week and a half that the Panthers Twitter feed said, and he's out for a week or 2, but they didn't put him on the PUP or the NFI. Still, what I'm especially curious about, Gene, is based on that time frame. Let's say this is a 2 to 4 week hamstring. What does that tell us? And then Chris Ivory, and this is just like last year's training camp where he has a hamstring. Are these guys, and as much or as little as you want to use Stewart and Ivory as a point to say, okay, there is sometimes physiology playing in here. There is sometimes guys being quote-unquote wound tight and things like that. Or as you like to say about Stewart, like how old are his knees actually? Just as you see the stuff come across and you see the obvious jokes and things like that, what's the actual real information to pull out of this other than just here we go again?
Well, I think here we go again is important. So in a vacuum, I like to use today as a cutoff. So I'm more than happy to call any player that's had more than his expected share of injuries, and we can debate what that is too. Call those players injury prone. They have been prone to injury. They've had injuries. It's a proven fact. You can go back and look at we did that with Ben Tate. We did the hokey pokey with Ben Tate, all of the long list of things he's had. He has been injury prone. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a clear physiologic reason that any or all of those injuries are more likely to happen in the future. Is that the case for some of these players? Absolutely. Do we have enough information to say, in rare cases, yes. So Jordan Reed, I would be worried about him being prone to concussions. Miles Austin, I would be worried about him being prone to hamstring injuries. If it's a repeated injury to the same area, yeah. But otherwise, short of being in the training room and seeing all the testing they put these guys through, or we're starting to hear some things about teams using GPS on these guys to see how they move and all sorts of data from that perspective, almost like an eye in the sky during practice to compare day by day by day from month to month. Unless we have that data, I'm not comfortable saying DeMarco Murray is likely to have an injury this year. But here we go again, to me, is valid. So now we know that these players have had another injury, and if it's related to injuries or we can consider it a compensatory or cascade situation related to something they've had in the past, then yeah, I think then that would put a flag on them for this particular year going forward. We see that all the time during the regular season. Guys try to come back from injuries too soon. C.J. Spiller, Andre Johnson, Calvin Johnson to some respect. Lots and lots and lots of these guys where they don't get over those type of injuries. And does that mean that they're necessarily injury prone? I don't know that I would slap that label on them, but once there's an injury in play and a guy that we've seen not recover well in the past from other injuries, then yes, I think we have to stop and consider what that means for the rest of the season. But I'm not willing to say that about Arian Foster today, or Tony Romo today, or even C.J. Spiller today. But a guy like Jonathan Stewart, who we know never really recovered well from Achilles issues, who had an ankle surgery that we thought he was going to recover, 2 ankle surgeries that we thought he'd recover more quickly from last year and hasn't, or a guy like Chris Ivory, who always seems to be dinged up and not get over things quickly. I think, yes, there's real concern that those players could be considered injury prone, or that the relative risk of them having an injury in the 16-game regular season is higher than another player who hasn't had that injury at this point, but who has been prone to injury in the past.
And it is, like most things, you have to go on a case-by-case basis, and you have to look at the surrounding factors. I do think that we will eventually, and Gene, I think we've talked about this before, there will eventually be the medical technology for...
Well, it's genetics, right? I mean,
right.
I can go through, it's been a while since I've learned these things. We can talk about different types of collagen and different types of connective tissue, and we could talk about bone density, or we could talk about just the general size of somebody's bone structure and frame. I mean, just looking at my little skinny wrist here, I'm not going to hold up as well as another guy my size whose bone structure is a little bit big. But you can't tell that from TV. You're not going to hear that from the athletic training office. No medical staff is going to come out and say, well, this guy, I mean, that's stuff that these guys probably know, though. They are doing pre-concussion testing to see, what any potential for neurocognitive issues. They're probably doing some isometric testing to see if one side of the body is a little bit weaker than the other, either because of a current injury that they're rehabbing or just in general. There has been some stuff about GPS out there. Teams are privy to this information, and you better believe they're looking into it, but we're not going to get that information. We could go down the slippery slope and open the can of worms about, at some point, are we going to be doing testing for certain types of, to see if you have this particular type of gene expressed for that particular type of collagen and what that might mean for somebody else, or you already have certain numbers of tau proteins in your brain that might make you a little bit more prone to concussions. Those things are probably coming, and I don't know if it's those particular examples or something else. But when you're talking about injury-prone nature, a lot of that, it's a good portion of that is going to be physiologic. It's going to be genetic. Now, are there going to be players that are relatively lazy and who aren't in as good a condition, or players that have no regard for their personal safety and body and are a little bit more willing to put their body in a place where they may get injured than others? Yes, those things don't have to do with genetics or physiologic things necessarily. But, there are going to be situations where in the future, we may be able to identify certain genetic components or physiologic components that can be tested for. Whether or not the Players Association and the labor unions allow that to happen, how teams use them, how they're applied, whether or not we know anything about that. Again, all those are open questions, but it really is not there's no clean way. It's just plain messy to try to apply an injury-prone term to somebody going forward, again, unless it's something very specific where we know a player is going to be treated a little bit differently because of the number of concussions he's had and the severity of those, or we know that if a player has had a left hamstring strain time and time and time again, the chances that there's some scarring in that area that's prone to re-injury is going to be high. So I would feel comfortable labeling guys this year like Jordan Reed, like Wes Welker. We did this with Austin Collie when he came back. Yes, he's coming back. He's coming back to the Patriots. It's a great situation, but you just know that there's more risk with him someplace else, and guys like Miles Austin. But you're just not going to be able to twist my arm to say Arian Foster is a clear injury risk this year, or DeMarco Murray is a clear injury risk, or at least put a relative percentage on it. Is Arian Foster more injury prone than Marshawn Lynch? Both of them had back problems. Foster's had surgery, maybe Lynch needs surgery and we don't know about it. Put the relative risk on those two guys. How do you do that? So just be careful about just blithely labeling somebody as injury prone, because we just don't have enough information to make that call. Yeah, guys that have been injury prone in the past are probably a little bit more risky than others. You're going to guess right at some times. We talk about David Dodds is one of the best projectors, and he's running at a 60 to 63% success rate. That's a huge difference between 50-50. Doesn't seem like it, but it really is. So yes, maybe assigning a 5% additional relative risk to Arian Foster versus, even the first name that came to mind was Matt Forte. Is that legitimate? Is LaShawn McCoy legitimate, who's had concussions and other stuff in the past? It's just, in my mind, it's just too messy to do.
And it's based on perception a lot, too. Again, as I was tussling and tangling with different people on Twitter after the Gronkowski news, Julius Thomas had one ankle injury that basically cost him 2 years of his career. He played in 4 games each of his first 2 years, but played in is, that's taking it very loosely. He caught a pass. And then he missed 2 games last year, I think, with a bulky knee. So you're talking about a guy who has, at best, played in 22 of 48 possible games in his career. He's never mentioned as injury prone. But Rob Gronkowski, because people have been burned by his injuries, is.
Just to boil that discussion down a little bit more. I rambled on for 5 minutes there, but I had 2 comments tweeted to me that kind of boil this down to just 140 character sound bites. And they both came from the same guy, Gunther Porchman. He said that the thing with prone to him is that it seems to assume something physiologic. Otherwise, it's just history. That's a great way to put it. He also sent a quote to me that he heard from Bill Belichick that I'm going to insert into my injury-prone refresh here. It says, "You tell me which guys are going to get hurt, and I won't play them." Right? So, I mean, in many ways, it's as simple as that. That's really simplifying things, but I think both of those things are valid ways to look at them without me rambling on for 5 minutes about, all those little specific things. That, to me, that's as simple as it is.
We love it when you ramble on, Gene. We love it, and I'm going to unabashedly say, and I've said this often. I don't know that I've ever really just come out, not really come out, but I love Bill Belichick. I love his approach to the role that he has. I love his. You read between the lines of his philosophy, and he's actually a very flexible, agile, nimble, mental person. He intellectually, and I even think his way of interacting with the media shows a very high intelligence, and little things like that, it tickles me. Although, then you have Bill Belichick, I think, was it at the Combine, when he showed up and just was friendly and smiling and answering all the questions, and all the person's like, what happened to our Belichick?
He does that all the time. If he's in the mood, if you catch him right, so many of my defensive files are Bill Belichick, because if he's in the mood or a reporter asks a question the right way, he will go on long, historical teaching rants with all sorts, not rants, but there's lots of really good stuff come out of his press conference transcripts that you don't really get from anybody else. And yes, there's a whole lot of the hoodie, the short one-word answers or brief where you're not going to get any information out of him. But there's other times where his reputation is as a teacher, and he'll do that in the press room as well if the questions are asked in such a way that he's comfortable doing it, and it's not going to compromise what he's trying to do with his team in that particular week or that particular year.
Exhibit B of the media not understanding an introvert.
Yeah. Yes, and I would imagine that we probably wouldn't call him an introvert if we hung around him outside of the sphere of the NFL.
Well, I mean, if it were one or two people, yeah, probably, but we would call him an introvert. But if he was in a large group of people asking him a bunch of questions that he could care less about, and he just wants to do his job, yeah, we'd probably misunderstand him again.
Okay, I want to get to one other medical situation, and then we'll do some Audible Live questions from the audience before we sign off here on this Thursday night. And speaking of curmudgeonly coaches, we have to talk about, and no Werthers for you, Odell Beckham, as in the one thing that was on everybody's mind, including our own Andrew Garda, who is there covering the Giants training camp, is, man, Coughlin seems annoyed, irritated, frustrated with Odell Beckham. Odell Beckham had a hamstring that cost him, OTA, part of OTA's minicamp, and it sounds like, Gene, that it's the same hamstring. And Coughlin, and I don't know when he's gonna. So how can we translate that for us? Because Beckham was a guy who was falling to the very late rounds of redraft leagues, and you kind of felt like, well, why should he be falling so far when other rookies are going 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th round? He's got the opportunity, but now is this the kind of thing, especially with a rookie, that makes you say, unless this reverses course and quickly, probably it's best to not draft him this year?
So yeah, just to cover the injury first, it certainly seems like an aggravated hamstring injury. We know those are at least as severe, if not more severe, than the initial injury. You don't know exactly how long Beckham would have been out with the first injury because it happened sort of toward the end of OTAs, and then they'd not practiced for a month. So has this injury been a 4-week injury that he was just now coming back from? Was it a significant grade 1, early grade 2, and then this is going to be something more? Was it just a cramp early in OTAs and just a small thing now where he was talking about putting the helmet and pads on and getting back in pretty quickly? I think we'll know the answer to that pretty quickly. If he's not back on the practice field within a couple of days, then I think there's reason to be concerned for a couple of reasons. Mostly because of the aggravation, all the stuff we talked about in the past. But the Coughlin thing, I think you can take one of two ways. One is he aggravated because he's getting the sense from the medical staff or his own sense that it's not that significant injury and he wants him on the field now for that reason? Or two, because they thought he was over it, now he knows it's a significant injury and he really wanted Beckham to be a major part of the offense early in the season, and he's frustrated because that's unlikely to happen. That's something I don't know that we're going to know the answer to either until we see just how long it takes him to get back on the field. If he's back on the practice field tomorrow, through the weekend or early next week, probably not much to worry about unless he has a third aggravation, which would really get him to shut down for a while. But if he's out for 2 or 3 weeks at this point and we don't see him take any practice reps until leading up to the third week of the preseason, then yes, I think it's time to think very hard about where he is on your draft board and maybe leave him in the category of a high priority free agent where you're ready to move on him at some point in the midseason when he looks ready and when he looks like he's getting some more practice reps.
Okay, and just before I toss this in a little bit different spin over to Matt, Gene, I want to ask you, I mean, I assume you're always putting together, you're always adding data to a file on each player, on each coach, on these different things. That Coughlin seems so frustrated with Beckham. I mean, do you take any meaning out of that? Do you put just like a little note? You know, the doctor always has a chart out and is writing something. Like, what are you writing? Are you writing something in your chart about Odell Beckham right now?
It's a Seinfeld episode.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. He's fussy about a lot of things. You know, so I don't know that I attribute one of those scenarios that we just talked about as being more likely than another. I'm worried about it because it's an aggravated injury. I'd be a little bit more confident saying one versus the other if we knew what was going on in those 4 weeks between mini camp and the start of training camp. They obviously felt enough of him. They felt like he was in good enough condition to not start camp on the PUP list. It'd give him a couple of days to ease into things and get ready because he hadn't been around all that much, you know, from a physiologic perspective for the previous 4 weeks. I think if there's something that comes out, if that little bit of information comes out in a future local beat writer article, we'll have a little bit more information there. But there isn't anything that's sending my spidey senses in one direction or the other. I would probably work from the worst case scenario backwards, though. I would assume that he's going to be out 2 or 3 weeks, even though he said he wanted to be out there in helmet and shoulder pads today. I'd work from the assumption that this is an aggravated injury that could take a little bit longer to get better than the alternative at this point, and then be pleased if he comes back a little bit sooner.
So this is like Grandpa Simpson. You know, old man shakes fist at cloud. Old man shakes fist at wide receiver. Exactly. So Matt, and feel free to drop some RSP knowledge about specifically Odell Beckham's style and why hamstring health is important to it, or just what your thoughts were on Beckham for redraft leagues coming in. But what I want to ask you about something else that's been coming out of Giants training camp, and something that kind of ties the room together for all of the fantasy value of Giants receivers this year. It's this idea that it's about getting the ball quick for Eli Manning. And we rarely hear this about quarterbacks that have 2 Super Bowl rings, quarterbacks that are in their mid-late 30s, that we're trying to revamp his style, and we're going to put him in an offense that asks him to be different. Some of this is necessity, I guess, because their offensive line is in flux. But what does your gut feeling tell you when you hear this idea? Eli's going to get the ball quick. From watching Eli all these years, could this work?
Yeah, I think it can work, but I think that it's not something that's going to work great for fantasy owners. I don't think that Eli Manning is ever going to, return to that level that you're saying, oh, he's that Matt Stafford type of player who might break into the elite tier of fantasy quarterbacks at some point. I think that you're looking at a low-end quarterback one at best, and I think what they're trying to do here is 2 things. One is that, like you said, the offensive line. 2, we know that you give Eli Manning a lot of time to make decisions, and you're basically tossing a coin, and that's really it's a really tough situation there. And then when you look at the fact that Ryan Nassib is the number 2 quarterback or fighting for that job, and he played in a quick strike offense, so it could be also we need to have an offense that matches some of our depth. If we have depth at quarterback, and if we think Nassib is that guy, then let's find an offense that suits him so that we can, force Manning to be the best he can be. And if he can't do it soon enough, then we can send him along the way of Kurt Warner and let him take his chances elsewhere where he chooses what team he wants to play for again. And and let Nassib have a shot at it. But, you look at this whole thing with Coughlin, and I think the thing that I want to mention here is that I think that Coughlin is really expressing more than anything disappointment, because this team, including Eli Manning, really wanted Odell Beckham, And I think they believe that Odell Beckham is a more talented player than Ruben Randle. Ruben Randle almost alludes to it himself when he talks about his former teammate with the level of excitement that he has for him coming to the Giants and what he can do. But to me, it's not so much of what Beckham can do that's going to cause hamstring injuries, because he's probably a more athletic version of Greg Jennings when you take a look at what his skill sets are. He can go deep. He can win some 50-50 balls. He's really good after the catch. He's the type of player that you want to see him improve his routes, but he shows enough that you can see him fitting into a West Coast offense and being a real good asset there. But I think that what you see is that he's typical of a lot of young wide receivers who are stars on teams where they ask him to use his athleticism, but he may not necessarily have to be a great technician and keep his body in as fine-tuned form as he would expect in the NFL. And there's going to be that adjustment when making that transition where a small injury turns into a larger one because he tries to push it because he wants to do well for the team, and he doesn't take care of his body, doesn't quite know how to take care of it at the level that a pro does, and next thing you know, his season goes down the tubes, and he's healthy for all of about 2 or 3 weeks during the year. This is something that happens with a lot of players, and it often happens with wide receivers because they don't know how to condition and be ready for the rigors of the NFL game, and it may take them a year or two to really get up to speed on that professional level front of how just to be a pro athlete.
Okay, before we go to the Audible Live questions, I do want to ask one question that I got via email, and this is coming from someone. It's fun. Every now and then, someone will reach out to me and say, "Hey, listen to the show or love Football Guys, and I live in Central Texas, and you want to get lunch or sometime or something like that." And this is from one of those people, actually, Kevin Karshnick and Rusty Bowles. It's been a yearly tradition, annual tradition for I don't even know how many years that we go get wings together sometime in August. It's coming up again, but he said he wanted to ask a question, and this is an interesting question, and I don't quite know how to answer it, and that's part of the reason that I want to ask and get y'all's takes before I try to compose an answer to this, because in some ways it's a simple, straightforward question, but in other ways it's a question that is very difficult to just come up with a concise answer, or maybe not. Maybe each of you will say no. Hey, Kevin asked, how do you? And this is like putting ourselves in the place of somebody listening to our show right now, or a Football Guy subscriber. How do you decipher contradicting opinions on players? I have C.J. Spiller at 10, and Matt has him at 24. His ADP is 15. I respect both of you, but you made it hard for me to take a strong stance whether I should target this player or not. So I guess I'll ask you first, Gene, because you're usually so level-headed about these things. What is your advice to people out there that are navigating not just within Football Guys, but across the whole? I mean, that's one of the things about the proliferation of fantasy advice. Now it's kind of like parenting. Like you can find something out there that'll tell you this is the smartest, best way to do it, and you can find another article that says no, that's the absolute worst thing you could possibly do. So, what words, if any, do you have to somebody with Kevin's question? Like, how do I navigate through all of these conflicting opinions?
Well, first, I wouldn't fear when you see that situation. I think that's a good situation because it can lead you to better understand what's going on with that particular player, particular team situation, whatever it may be. And then, the vast majority of us are very approachable. So if you're not sure why, maybe you agree that fantasy person A has this player ranked at 5 and don't understand why fantasy person B has them ranked at 15 or 20. Send them an email, tweet them, ask them, you're a little bit off consensus here. Can you give me a little bit of information why this may not be the case? And you can do a little bit of research yourself before that. Why am I in agreement on this side? Why are some other folks have a different opinion? What might be driving that opinion? A lot of times you'll have some idea about what that may be before you even start that. But I think, go ahead and email somebody and ask the question, what makes you on the other side of this spectrum? And then take that opinion into consideration. And then oftentimes that'll give you better information than you had about that player or that situation than before you started.
Okay, and you said the vast majority of us are approachable, and we all know who you're talking about that is not approachable. It's Chase Stewart. No, I love Chase. Chase is wonderful. He is totally approachable. I just wanted to make a joke, and I figured Chase was one of the few people I could make that about. No. So Matt, what's your advice here? Is it just when Bloom and I disagree? Come on, you're going
Come
to listen
on,
to all
man.
of them.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I look at it this way. I mean, well, if you're a numbers guy, you could go to, you can go to the accuracy rankings and see that maybe Bloom's a better running back guy than I am, but I'm a better quarterback and wide receiver guy, arguably over the past few years, or maybe not. I don't know. But then you're not getting any context with that either. So, well, I shouldn't maybe go there. But let's just look at it this way: is that when you look at the differences with these, part of it is also seeing what resonates with you and what you're good at. If you're good at being able to discern running backs, and you know that that's a skill that you have, and you listen to the Spiller argument from me and go, I respect Matt, but that doesn't really resonate with what I'm thinking with Spiller. What Bloom has to say does. Then you know that you're more on the upside of Spiller in that regard, and that's two things there's two things that you have to consider with that. One is that you are willing to pick him early. If that's the case, and you understand that you see the wisdom of my argument about him not being able to stay healthy enough, that or his carry count's not ever going to be high enough that you're going to see him really as that top 12 player again. If you're thinking that, then you know that you're going to have a pretty good hedge plan in the mid to late rounds with running backs, because you are recognizing that C.J. Spiller presents a little more risk reward for you compared to maybe the safety of a player that at running back at that same in that same area that you're going to draft them within a round or two of Spiller, who might be more of a may not have Spiller's flashy upside, but is someone that can be steady for you, meaning that you may not have to take a back as early or may not have to consider an alternate plan. And it's about kind of how you look at strategies. And this is the type of thing that I think is important that I'm trying to figure out a way to write about, because we always talk about the draft, and we always talk about draft strategies as far as win your league with your draft. And my point all the time is that your league is really a table with several with 3 to 4 legs, and that your draft you're not very rarely are you going to be able to build a table that goes straight down and has 4 prongs on it and holds it up in the middle. You're just not going to do that very often in your draft in quality leagues. So as a result of that, sometimes what you can do with the draft is you can often go kind of away from the consensus of what most people talk about, which is let's try and build the most balanced team that we can with this many positions and this many positions and this value here and this value here, and go, you know what, forget all that. Let's, if C.J. Spiller is a player that I'm curious about and I'm thinking about taking, why don't I maybe, and I know I'm good at picking running backs, or I'm worried about, or maybe I'm good at being able to make trades, maybe I go heavy on a certain position in my draft and do that enough that now I'm setting myself up to be able to have some bargaining power after the draft to make trades, even if my team is really unbalanced at one position or another. So when you look at the news of somebody like Spiller, sometimes it's a good idea to say, am I weak at assessing running backs or strong? And if I'm weak at it, maybe I pick more running backs, take more chances with them, and know that if I hit on some of them, then I can take some of that information and leverage the depth that I have at running back to get other positions early in the season.
Matt, I just wanted to let you know that I think I said I need to pay you royalties, because I've been using that 4 legs of the table metaphor on almost every podcast I've been guesting on, because I think it's important. And just, on the topic of, we just did a big hiring round at Football Guys, so many great talented writers added to the mix: Matt Harmon, Dan Hendry, Phil Alexander, Scott Bischoff, John Lee, I'm sorry, I think it's Bonema, Bonnema, Ari Engel, our FF Esquire, our lawyer, in one of many, but who writing our law and rules column. so many. Scott Buzzard also doing terrific data models on daily fantasy sports. Earlier this offseason, we also added Alex Emilio and Austin Lee. And there were a lot of really great writers that we had to turn away just because there's not room for everybody. I wish there was. But one of the things, people asking for advice or feedback, and one of the things that I seem to say a lot to folks is, I just what's your area of expertise? What's your specialty? What's something that you do that is different or stands out? And I think what Matt's point here, and I know you said this before, about those other three legs of the table, trades, waiver wire, and lineup setting, are they're not covered to the same extent as the draft.
And I will be this year. I'm going to be covering that a fair bit this year because I agree with you. I think it is undercovered.
So I think this is where this is a place to make your mark. Is become one of the best at that, because there's not nearly as much attention and energy given to that as player evaluation and draft strategy. So and to get to Kevin's question, and I'm going to echo a lot of what Gene said, which is filling out your file. And I often seek out, when I'm scanning Twitter and I see a title of an article that I totally disagree with, I will click on that article and read it, partially because I love to argue, as everybody knows. But also, I want to know the best case against my position, and I want to factor that in, and it's just being rigorous. And it helps so much, and I often think that's what y'all out there are looking for, is not so much someone to tell you what to do, but you want to either confirm your instincts, intuitions, and stance, or you want to make sure that if somebody you respect and trust is going against your stance, that you've thought through what they have to present. Now, there's also a scenario where, well, I don't really have a stance. I don't know how I feel about C.J. Spiller yet. Well, that's when you read through these cases and you just see what moves you. You see what resonates with you and your philosophy and what you think is important about being successful on the football field, or what maybe it brings up past cases, or like, yeah, I remember drafting somebody like C.J. Spiller who's never quite 100% healthy. No thanks. So read it, think about it, let it marinate. It doesn't have to be, it can be something that 2 or 3 days later, or often it's only when you're on the clock that you have that clarity and know that something is compelling or another argument is not. But it was a good question, I think, to just spur discussion, and something that we don't usually try to put ourselves on the other side of that, even though we're always on the other side of that whenever we're doing our drafts and we're consuming everything that we all put out there. I know, when Dr. Gene said, I'm not going to put you on the spot here, Gene. When Dr. Gene, I had Arian Foster outside of the first 2 rounds, and when Dr. Gene said, don't worry, it's like any other year for Foster. Don't treat this year differently. And I said, I'm going to have to rethink this. So we get to some Audible Live questions. And as always, you guys are, we love the lifeblood of the show, so we want to always give a little segment of the show to what's on your mind, although hopefully we've covered a lot of that already. And what we do here at the end of the show is we'll pass it around, and one of us will ask another panel member a question until we go around. So I'm going to actually just pass it off to you first, Gene, and give you the opportunity. Remember, use the hashtag #AudibleLive, and you can ask these at any time in the week, but especially in the last few hours leading up to the show. So you can ask any question and ask it to either of us.
I can't remember. I think we've talked about Terrence Williams a little bit, and it may have been you, Bloom, but I want to ask Matt this question from Jonathan Brown, Mondo Tikimon, about Terrence Williams and why he's not getting that much love, because I think I agree with this. I think, Jason Witten getting a little bit older, and Des Bryant being there, I think Terrence Williams has some wide receiver 2 upside today, and I don't think it has much to do with Austin being gone, but I think we saw some good things from Terrence Williams toward the end of last year. But maybe you just kind of refresh people's minds on what you thought about Williams before the draft, what you saw on him in his college tape, and where you have him in your projections.
Yeah, I like Williams, and I think that he has that potential to develop into a Chad Johnson-like threat before Johnson went Ocho Cinco on us. And I think that, Williams is the type of guy who's a smooth route runner, capable of becoming a really good technician in this league. He has the deep speed. Maybe even you could say Roddy White, not as strong or rugged as Roddy White, but he has that potential to be kind of that technician who can make the precision plays as well as the vertical plays. And he is somebody that really caught my eye at the Senior Bowl, in addition to what I saw on tape. And it's not, we talk about the Senior Bowl a lot on here, I know, and it's turned into a drinking game, but it's one of these things where I can't say that I've watched players and see them improve as quick as they have between practices as well as between years, from one year to the next. I don't see that as often as you would expect, not as noticeably. And I think Williams was one of those glaring examples that was the exception to the rule there. I saw him improve between his second to last year at Baylor to his final season, and then also each practice day. And you could see him getting better, and the comments about him getting better with just certain techniques. And I think that he grew fast in the Cowboys organization. So when you look at those things, I have him projected right now as my number 37 receiver. So he's at the low end of a low-end wide receiver 3 right now. I'm giving him, my stats for him right now in terms of what I've projected are 60 receptions, 900 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Probably a little bit on the lower end of the enthusiasm that some people might have if they're on his bandwagon. But I think it's a good starting point right now in a Cowboys offense where there are a number of things that we want to look at. It's not just Jason Witten that that people may have a reason for overlooking Williams, but it's also the fact that Scott Linehan's offense also incorporates a lot of throws to the running back, and they have some plays that work really well that we talked about, Bloom on the couch, that James Light talked about in his blog last season about Linehan and the Lions offense going to the slot receiver, a guy that might be an interesting bye week option once again this year, or at least a guy to consider might be a Dwayne Harris, who might play that Michael Clayton role when healthy and getting a lot of these wide open looks. That would be, that could go for really big plays, especially, with Harris's skill after the catch. So I still see enough weapons split among, in Dallas, and how that they split it up, that I like Williams as a player to consider as a first off the bench fantasy option, but I don't see him necessarily as a wide receiver 2 this year. Next year, I think that's a really good. I think people are a year early on him. I think that's probably where I would look at it.
All right, your turn, Matt.
All right. Well, let's take a look at a couple people here that we have listed. Oh boy, I'm trying to look for some that we've had here that we got. Anybody can do one for proxy for me in terms of what we got with questions, because either I'm looking at something strange or I'm not seeing the questions that we're getting on the Audible here. Actually, here's one. Bloom, Darren Danker asks, my league has an IR spot. Are there any likely designated return players you would target in a draft?
Yeah, and this is going to. I mean, I do think that we talked about a player earlier. There's not any offensive players right now that I would expect are going to be in that range. I don't think that it's all been on the defensive side of the ball. So, when I hear that, I'm thinking of somebody like Navarro Bowman is someone who jumps into my mind as someone in IDP drafts that you can take later on, and by midseason you'll likely get him back. I would say Von Miller was somebody that might have been on that list, but it sounds like he's going to be ahead of schedule, or the Honey Badger.
Matthew. Yeah,
Matthew the Honey Badger. So I think that we don't have anybody, and Gene, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't really think there are any offensive candidates at this moment for somebody that looks like they're in the range. Anyone come to mind for you?
No, unless somebody signed. I can't even make a case for Jermichael Finley, I don't think. I mean, I think that question, there's going to be somebody. It's been knock on whatever you like to knock on, relatively quiet. It seems like late July last year there was, a new major injury with, from Dennis Pitta to Jeremy Macklin to all, those other guys from a day-to-day basis. Percy Harvin, an issue in the summertime. We really haven't had that guy yet. It's coming. We're not going to get through the preseason without major injuries to offensive skill players. But I agree with you. There isn't anybody there that we wouldn't expect to come off PUP or the NFI list sometime this week.
Okay, now I get a question, and I get to ask. Well, I kind of ask you a question. I guess I'm cheating a little bit, Gene. I'm asking another question. But and there's when you put IDP in your handle, then that's a good way to get to the top of the list whenever I'm going to ask Dr. Gene a question. And the IDP Roundtable, getting some good questions. The IDP Roundtable is going to be back, and we're going to get the doc and the guru on. But this is a question, and Gene, I don't know that this was a totally clear-cut question when we talked about it in the spring. And if you feel like it is, then go to number 2 on the board. But this is and by the way, and Matt, you said that rookie drafts are probably over, but we got the RSO Writers League coming up, so rookie drafts are still going on out there, Gene. First IDP in a rookie draft, and if that's boring to you, then go to second. And about what offensive players, this is from Steve Schultz, Steve IDP, what offensive or defensive players are on par with whoever that number 1 IDP is in a rookie draft?
I don't think the number 1 overall IDP is a clear-cut question. I think you have to ask yourself 2 questions. One is, do I like J.J. Watt or Robert Quinn? One much more than the other. And
rookie draft. Sorry. I hate to cut you off mid-sentence. No, that's fine.
Good. I think I would still take C.J. Mosley first. I don't think there's a defensive end or a defensive back that's interesting enough to me. I suppose there's still a chance that we'll hear enough good things about Ryan Shazier or Telvin Smith or Christian Kirksey to challenge Mosley. So as you said, now I understand why you said look for who might be your second person. I tentatively had Smith a little bit ahead of Shazier. If I had to do that over again, hearing what Dick LeBeau had to say about Shazier and my concerns with Smith's size, Shazier would probably be that. I wouldn't necessarily call him 1A, but he's probably in that second tier by himself. Who would be at the same point as Mosley? I think anywhere from the back end of the first round, when you're looking at the first quarterback, Bridgewater, Manziel, Bortles, even whoever you think that might be, that's where I'd start to consider Mosley. I'd consider Mosley right around the area where your first tight end would come off the board, and that's you're talking about Jason Morrow and Eric behind Eric Ebron a little bit, what I consider Mosley, and then I would probably take a chance on any second-tier tight end, whoever you think that may be, whether it's Matt's guys like Latimer and Richardson and my guys as well, or if you're in on Kelvin Benjamin and Marquise Lee, it would be right around that time frame. And then I think everybody's got a little bit different opinion on the running back side, so if you carry that tier across there, maybe you're looking at Trey Mason, maybe you're looking at Devonta Freeman, maybe you're looking at Terrence West. Some guys are going to have those players a clear tier higher than a C.J. Mosley. Some people are just not going to want to take a chance on Trey Mason or Terrence West till a little bit later. So I think that's what you're looking at. I wouldn't consider Shazier, Smith, Kirksey until we're getting early or late second round at the earliest for Shazier, and I'm probably not looking at some of those other linebackers until the middle of the third round or later.
And this is one of the things that Bloom 100 gets at is how you slot offensive and defensive players, and I think he's about, and it's Gene, and I think that we're getting at the same point where I had Mosley around number 15, and somewhere in that early second round range, and I always slot in that top IDP right at the point where you look at the offensive talents and you say there's not elite upside here anymore. So I want to take all of the players that have some appreciable chance of being elite players, wide receiver ones, or at least top 20 wide receivers, top 20 running backs, top 10 quarterbacks, which is a high bar now, maybe top 6 to 8 tight ends. And if you don't see that very likely, or not even very likely, just, not an appreciable chance, that's when you just go to the safe haven of that linebacker. And, depending on your need, you may go a little bit higher. Hopefully this show continues to be a safe haven for fantasy advice, analysis, football talk, camaraderie, some laughs, intentional and unintentional. Maybe that was one right there. We thank you. This is exciting. I think everybody is getting that feeling of exhilaration. Football is coming back. Football news, football stories, football analysis is in full bloom, so to speak. And we're going to be here every Thursday night live. We're going through the preseason watch list at the site. You're going to get the gut check. You're going to get reading the defense. You're going to get so much other stuff. Check out the apps. Subscribe. Football Guys Players Championship for those of you ready to make the high stakes plunge. So much. I think I heard FanDuel opened their lobby. You can look at the values for week 1 already. We're sick, but so are you. So that's why we're here, to be sick and obsessed together and make each other feel normal for it. So we hope we continue to help you feel normal. Hope we continue to give you something worthy of your time and attention, the most precious thing you have. And we hope you continue to stay classy.